Welcome to another episode of Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, where certified financial planner Lauren Sherman shares thoughts on having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, an abundance of wealth inside portfolios and out, and lessons learned from clients and mentors over the years.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining me for another Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement. And before jumping in today, I also want to thank everyone who is new to the show for checking us out, as we've had a lot of new listeners who have just joined us in the past couple of months. So if that's you, thanks for having a listen, and feel free to catch up on some past episodes as we are slowly growing a pretty good library of topics we've covered. Of course, I am your host, Lauren Sherman, and I thought The Many Colors of Annuities was the appropriate title for today's talk. Not only are there many variations of annuities, but just like the neon lights of Las Vegas that grab our attention, annuities are often marketed as the flashy next hot thing. We are going to do our best to talk through which of these flashy benefits actually have merit and which you want to avoid. In one of my first episodes titled Annuities, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I shared the story of 3 different retirees and their own experiences with annuities. I will link this one in the show notes, as this was a shorter episode so you can catch up quickly if you missed that one. However, for today, I'm going to get more specific as we talk through several different types of annuities. We will also talk about different benefits and crediting strategies. And finally, we will talk through some situations where they can be a good fit and others where they may not be the right solution. The goal for today isn't so that you'll be an annuity expert by the end, but that you will have a better understanding what category different annuities fall into, what some of their pros and cons are, and get a better sense if something like this is a good fit for your retirement plan, or just as importantly, if it's not a good fit for your situation. I plan on knocking this out all in one episode, but what often happens is that listeners will email me with a few questions or their thoughts, and this will prompt me to record a follow-up episode to cover some of the things I overlooked the first time. So I always appreciate your feedback, and I'm always searching for new topics to cover in future episodes. So don't hesitate to email me at shermanl@integrityguidance.com so you can share your ideas. You can also find my email in the show notes, as I have it linked for your convenience. Let's start out with a 10,000-foot view of what an annuity is and what purpose the different types can serve. At its core, an annuity is an insurance contract, so you will see these issued by insurance companies. These were originally designed to pay out a lifetime income so retirees would not outlive their assets. In this sense, they can serve a similar purpose, much like your Social Security check or a pension from your employer. Over the years, they have become more versatile, but before we dive into all of the variations, let's start as broad as we can with the 2 main categories every annuity falls into, which is the category of income annuities and deferred annuities. The idea of income annuities dates all the way back to the Roman Empire era, roughly 2,000 years ago, and more recently offered through insurance companies within the last 200 years. The concept is similar to life insurance, but in reverse. For example, if 100 people all pooled their funds together and everyone started receiving income from this large sum of money, most people would roughly get their money returned, ideally with some interest. The idea is that most people would live roughly to their life expectancy. However, some within this group would pass away early before they could receive enough income to break even. The idea is that for these people, it doesn't really matter that they didn't break even because, of course, they were no longer around, which means they didn't need the income to live off. On the flip side, others lived longer than expected, and the funds were available to continue their payments because those who died early left a surplus that went unspent. So from the most basic standpoint, those who lived long, healthy lives are the ones who came out ahead. I mentioned that life insurance is very similar, but in reverse. Those who live long, healthy lives continue to pay their life insurance premiums much longer, while those who would pass away earlier than expected would receive a windfall, or at least their beneficiaries would. Sometimes it's helpful to bring these products back to their roots, as these very basic concepts can become lost when you're no longer dealing with a group of 100 people, and instead you're looking at an insurance company with billions of dollars and a group too large to count. So an income annuity is the process of trading a lump sum of money in exchange for a guaranteed income stream. At least it's guaranteed to the extent that the insurance company can pay their obligations. We will talk more on this later, but for a few reasons, this really shouldn't be much of a concern, especially if you select a credible insurance company. The payout you receive depends on a handful of variables such as your age, gender, and what type of payout you select. Let's run through a couple of quick examples to illustrate this. In the first scenario, we have our 65-year-old retiree named John. He places $100,000 of his retirement account with an insurance company for a lifetime payout. He receives an annual check, or in many cases, these are deposited monthly, but in this case, he receives an annual check of $7,200 for as long as he lives. Now, of course, there will be a crossover point where if John dies before a certain age, he will receive less than his $100,000 back, and that money is simply gone. Remember from before, this is how the insurance company pays those who live longer than expected. Of course, he could also live long into retirement, at which point he could receive much more than his original $100,000. But aside from that, why else do you think John might consider a contract like this? For starters, perhaps John likes the idea of a pension and doesn't want to manage his money, or he's not particularly skilled in managing his money. He could also be very healthy, so he believes he will come out on the right side of that equation and receive more than he put in. Another popular reason is that his guaranteed income from Social Security and his pension, if he has one, do not quite cover his monthly needs. So he covers this with the income provided by his annuity and then leaves the rest of his assets in the stock market, hoping they will go up. This reduces John's stress as he knows he will have a certain amount of guaranteed income regardless of what the market does. To me, this approach can make a lot of sense as it allows people to live their retirement without worrying too much about their investments. If you are the type who likes guarantees and has a low risk tolerance for market fluctuations, then this type of annuity may be something to consider. The biggest downside is that if John passes away shortly into retirement and he has a strong desire to pass assets to his beneficiaries, then those funds are gone and can no longer be distributed. Additionally, much like when you decide how to receive your pension or Social Security payments, this is a permanent decision. So once John gives the insurance company $100,000, there's no going back on that decision. The easiest way to avoid this issue of having buyer's remorse or regretting your decision is to avoid making this an all or nothing proposition. If an immediate annuity is a good fit for your retirement plan, it should simply be one piece of the puzzle and should not overtake your entire plan. This second scenario I'll zip right through, but now John is more concerned about passing away before he collects very many payments from his immediate annuity. Also, he wants to be sure the payments continue for the rest of his wife's life in case he passes away first. So in this scenario, it's about more than just John. He's also planning for his wife's retirement, and perhaps they want to pass the funds along to kids if they don't end up using it. So to accomplish this, they've now based the immediate annuity on both of their lives instead of just John's. And they've added a cash refund if they both die before their $100,000 is paid out. Because we are adding more guarantees to the plan, the payout is going to be less to reflect this, and now the couple receives $6,300 per year for as long as they both are alive. Remember, before it was a $7,200 annual check. And as I mentioned, if they both pass away after, let's say, only half of the $100,000 has been paid back, then the remaining $50,000 would be paid to their beneficiaries because they added a cash refund option to their contract. In addition to the cash refund, other common guarantees that can be added are time-based, called a period certain. This just means that you could add a guarantee that the contract pays out a minimum of 10 or 20 years, for example, even if you aren't alive to collect the benefits. And one more consideration that I will mention, most income annuities are going to pay a flat payment that never changes. Some, however, offer a cost of living adjustment, and the payments increase each year, similar to Social Security. By adding this, your payments start much lower, but you are better protected against future inflation. Everything I've mentioned up to this point can also be referred to as an immediate annuity, named because income starts immediately. I also briefly want to point out another type of income annuity that is called a deferred income annuity. These are not widely offered or used these days, but they are another type of income annuity where income payments start after a predetermined age or number of years. So everything we've mentioned about income annuities apply to both immediate annuities as well as deferred income annuities. It's just a matter of when the income starts. That should give you a pretty good high-level overview of income annuities. And frankly, there are not a ton of details that we didn't talk about, as these are pretty simple contracts. Many of the most intelligent and analytical type thinkers who study and write about retirement planning for a living, a lot of these professionals are big proponents of making an income annuity part of the ideal retirement plan. Of course, with that said, any recommendation to include or not include an income annuity would be based on each individual's situation. But I just wanted to point out that there is strong academic backing for this approach. I actually find it a bit ironic that annuities can get scoffed at sometimes, while retirees tend to love receiving their Social Security check, and for those fortunate enough to have one, their pension check as well. Moving on to deferred annuities. Now, I started off by saying that every annuity falls into just one of two categories. We've already covered the first with income annuities. Now, let's move into the second category of deferred annuities. Now, these are not to be confused with deferred income annuities, as those fall under the first category, with income being the key word there. Deferred annuities can get quite a bit more complex, and there are several more options to cover. But the general idea is that you don't need income yet, but you may in, say, 10 years. So just as it sounds, the deferred annuity will defer the payments for a specific number of years, and you can earn interest in the meantime. For example, let's use John again to illustrate how this would work. If John is only 55 years old now, but he plans to retire in 10 years at age 65, he may want a deferred annuity contract that earns interest for 10 years. Then his payments start at age 65. Part of the reason he may do this is that, let's call it the retirement red zone, in those years when you're getting ready to retire, the timing of the market is very important. So having a guaranteed contract like an annuity as part of the plan can help lessen the importance of the timing of when he retires. And unlike the first scenario, John won't know exactly what his payments will be until he actually gets to his retirement age of 65, simply because, in most cases, he won't know how much interest he will earn over the next 10 years. So in the example I just gave with John at age 55, let's say he buys a deferred annuity, not a deferred income annuity, but just a deferred annuity. He buys this at age 55 and with the intention of starting income at his retirement age of 65. But a lot can happen in 10 years. Perhaps John isn't ready to retire just yet. Maybe he received an inheritance during that time and his planning has changed. Perhaps his contract underperformed expectations and he wants to see it grow more before starting income. You can probably come up with some scenarios in your own head, but life could change in a number of ways. So at the end of the 10-year contract, and just to mention quick, these do not have to be 10-year contracts, but that's one of the most common durations, so that's just what I'm using for this example. So at the end of the 10-year contract, John could start income if he'd like. He can leave the money in the annuity so it continues to grow. He can cash it out and put it in his bank account, although there would likely be some tax considerations to be aware of with this option. Or he could even pivot altogether and transfer it into another retirement account that he may have with Charles Schwab, Fidelity, or any number of financial institutions. So with deferred annuities, you are still making a time commitment, but it's not going to be a permanent decision that cannot be reversed like it is with the income annuities from our first category. To pause here for a moment, the reasons just mentioned are likely why deferred annuities have mostly replaced deferred income annuities, because deferred annuities offer flexibility, while the deferred income annuity, remember, that's in the first category where the decision is final. With that thinking, why would someone purchase a deferred income annuity to use for income in 10 or 15 years and lock in that decision when they could plan to do the same simply by using a deferred annuity and they don't have to lock in their decision? If you are going to reduce your liquidity and give yourself less flexibility, insurance companies need to reward you for that trade-off, but that reward often isn't there for the deferred income annuity. All right, I'll stop mentioning income annuities and we will stick with deferred annuities from here on out. If you're getting a little frustrated with the terminology, I'm right there with you. So please don't blame me. These terms all came out long before I started my career. I alluded to some of this already, but deferred annuities are generally going to ask you to stay invested in the contract for a specific number of years. It may be as short as 2 years, or I've seen some as long as 15 years. But roughly that 7 to 10 year range is most common. A couple of other characteristics of deferred annuities is that taxes are deferred until you take the money out. So unlike a CD or several other investments, your gain is not taxed until you make a withdrawal or until you pass away and someone else makes a withdrawal. Because of this, annuity income is taxed as ordinary income rather than at capital gain rates, which is typically going to be less advantageous for the annuity. There are some exceptions to this, and there are some tax planning opportunities that come with the fact that annuities offer tax deferral. But these are a couple of the reasons why it's important that your advisor have an understanding of your tax situation or at a minimum is working hand in hand with your CPA. In a perfect world, both of those are the case. One last thought on this, there is some more nuance to how annuities are taxed if you select to take guaranteed income for life, as would be the case with the immediate annuities that we first covered. This gets into exclusion ratios and some deeper level planning that I don't want to bore you with on today's talk, as some of the tax planning can get a bit complex. And I've touched on this a bit, but each deferred annuity is going to have its own duration. 7 to 10 years is the most common duration. But the reason this is important is that you have to pay what's called a surrender charge if you end your contract earlier than its term. The surrender charge will almost always start higher and then decline over time until, of course, it reaches zero after the final year of the contract. To give you a quick example of how this works, imagine you sign up for a 10-year annuity contract, but instead of making it just part of your plan by allocating 10 or 20% of your assets, you put 100% of your retirement assets into it. After just 1 year of the 10-year contract, you decide you want out. Your surrender charge for canceling the contract early might be 12%. If you wait a few more years, you might have to pay a 5% surrender charge. Or, of course, if you hold the annuity for its full duration, then you won't pay any surrender charges. I bring this up because almost every deferred annuity has a surrender charge that you can view before deciding if it's a good contract or not. This should never come as a surprise, but instead be viewed as a trade-off for the other benefits you're receiving from the annuity. In reality, the surrender charges should not come into play unless we've made a big mistake somewhere along the way, which typically only happens if we get into the wrong type of annuity or we're over allocating a larger percentage than we should have in the first place. So from this standpoint, if we are doing proper planning, surrender charges should play a minimal role, if at all. One last note I will mention on surrender charges. One way to avoid them if you really need money is to see if your insurance company will allow you to annuitize the contract, which they often will allow prior to fulfilling the full duration of the contract. For all intents and purposes, the term annuitizing simply means to convert your contract to an immediate annuity that pays out for life, just like we discussed at the start of the show. Remember, this decision is irreversible. A much more common way to take money out of a deferred annuity before its full duration is up is by free withdrawals. This can vary by contract, but in general, annuity contracts allow you to take up to 10% per year without paying any surrender charges. I know this is getting a little into the weeds, but I wanted to hit on tax deferral and surrender charges quick since these apply to almost any deferred annuity. To give a simple example of how the 10% free withdrawal works, let's imagine for a moment that you allocated 10% of your portfolio into a deferred annuity, which amounts to $300,000. Even if the surrender charge is 15%, if you were to end the whole contract, you would still have 10% liquid each year, or $30,000 in this case. The very next year, if your contract is still at $300,000, then you could take out another $30,000 without any surrender charges. So you can see pretty quickly how this adds up and how you can plan for your income needs accordingly. All right, now that we've laid the groundwork for what a deferred annuity is, let's talk about the different types. We will start off with the most simple type of deferred annuity, which is a fixed annuity. A fixed annuity is going to pay an interest rate for the duration of the contract. Depending on the type of fixed annuity you go with, you might lock in your interest rate for the full duration, or it may be recalculated each year, meaning it could go up or down. These often have options for shorter durations, so a real quick example might be a 4-year annuity that locks in your rate at 3.5%. You receive no better and no worse, as you know exactly what your return will be. If the rate is not locked in, perhaps you would receive 4% in the first year, then you would find out your new interest rate for year 2 after your first year is up. So with this type, for a 4-year contract, you may have one rate for year 1, another for year 2, a third for year 3, and of course a fourth rate for your year 4. Your rate may go up, may stay the same, or it could go down. This approach can make sense if rates are on the lower end and you believe they will go up over time. So that's pretty simple. Those are the two variations of a fixed annuity, which once again, they fall under the deferred annuity umbrella. And as I say that, I imagine some of this will be a little challenging to follow just listening to the podcast. So I will definitely include a cheat sheet for this one, or I might even create a visual for you. So be sure to check out the show notes for that. Let's move on to another popular annuity type called an indexed annuity. You might also hear these being called fixed indexed annuities, which is just another name for the same thing. Sometimes companies add the word fixed just to highlight that, just like the last annuity type we covered, these contracts cannot lose money in the market. Indexed annuities tend to have roughly about a 10-year time commitment typically. And as I just mentioned, the principal is completely market protected, so you will never see these go down in value unless you make a withdrawal, or if you add some additional features called riders that could have a cost to them. The attraction to indexed annuities is that they have the potential for greater upside than a fixed rate can offer, while still maintaining protection from any market losses. Now, my biggest problem with this type of annuity is that often they come with a sales pitch that ends right there. People hear something that resembles market-like upside with no downside, and rightfully their antennas go up as this sounds too good to be true. I touched on this before, but sometimes this leads to retirees putting too big of a percentage into just one solution rather than just making this one piece of their retirement. For the rest of the story, we need to talk about crediting strategies and how these indexed annuities grow, as you can't just have all of the upside with none of the downside. Nearly all indexed annuities today have several crediting strategies that you can choose from, which will determine how much interest your contract is credited each year. One of the most popular methods is to use what's called a participation rate. A participation rate will track an index, most commonly the S&P 500 index, and you will participate in the gains of this index over the next year. To start with, the insurance company will take a reading of where the S&P 500 is at the beginning of your contract. This will be the same starting point no matter which allocation method you choose. So using a participation rate, the insurance company will declare what this is before even entering into the contract. For example, you might have a participation rate of 60%, meaning that you participate in 60% of the S&P 500 gains. Or if you choose to track a different index, whatever gains that index has. As a reminder, I only mentioned gains as we are protected from any losses. So this is the trade-off. In order to have the insurance company protect us from losses, we have to give up a percentage of our gains. Let's look at two examples of how the participation rate method might look. First, you receive an S&P 500 reading at the start of your contract, then again in 1 year. And just for clarity, the S&P 500 is a pretty good barometer for the stock market as a whole. So sometimes I mention the market, even though more specifically I'm referring to the S&P 500 index. So I just mentioned that in case you hear me use these interchangeably. I probably do this more so because the market is easier to say than repeating S&P 500 over and over. So let's say our index went up 10% in the first year. This is great, and you are probably happy with your portfolio that is invested directly in the market. But remember, your indexed annuity contract has a participation rate, which in this example we said was 60% for the first year. This means that instead of seeing your account go up 10%, we get 60% of that gain, which is a net 6% gain. Another way they will do this, depending on which crediting strategy you choose, is instead of just taking one index reading to start the year and another at the end, they will take a separate reading each month and average this out over the course of 12 months. This is just a difference I wanted to point out, as you will notice some participation rates are annual and some are called monthly averaging. Since this is such a popular method to select, let's talk through how this could play out within the first 5 years of a contract. Year 1, we already started with our 60% participation, and our contract is credited with 6% interest since the market returned 10%. In year 2, our participation rate goes up to 65%, as this can be adjusted annually by the insurance company. This year, the market, once again meaning the S&P 500 index, this goes up 7%. 65% of that gain equals 4.55%. So that's what we're credited with in year 2. So we are off to a good start as we received a 6% return and then 4.55% in the first 2 years. You may still be a little underwhelmed as you see your investments that are directly in the market going up much faster because, of course, they don't have a participation rate slowing down growth. But let's illustrate this in year 3. In year 3 of this example, we have a pretty big market correction and the S&P 500 goes down 30%. We were still at the same 65% participation rate, but in this year, it didn't make a difference since the market went down. Remember, we cannot lose money in the market with indexed annuities, as we are only tracking an index and not directly invested in it. So our worst case scenario is 0. So in this third year, we received no return as we were credited with 0% interest for that year. It's in these years that annuity owners are happy they allocated some of their market correlated assets into something that is market protected. And remember, with our market correlated assets, it always takes a bigger gain to make up for losses. In the example I just gave where the market goes down 30%, it takes almost a 43% gain to make up for this loss. If that doesn't sound quite right when I say it at first, think about this in round numbers. If we start with 100 and lose 50% of it, we would now be at 50. Now that we are at 50, we would need 100% gain to double our money to get back to 100. If instead we had a 50% gain, we would only be at 75 and still would have a ways to go before getting back to 100. That's not to discourage you from investing directly in the market, as this should likely be a large part of your retirement planning, but it's just to point out the math of it and to illustrate where indexed annuities can be advantageous. With the indexed annuity, when the market goes down 30% in that third year, you're not losing any of your previous gains from the prior 2 years, as gains are locked in after each year. Additionally, when we start the fourth year, we don't have to wait to recover from the 30% drop before showing a gain. Perhaps in that fourth year, we don't get the 43% jump to get back to where we were in our market correlated assets, but we do see a big jump of 25%. Let's say we are still at our participation rate of 65%. So now, after the S&P 500 goes up 25%, we would participate in 65% of that for a net gain of 16.25 that year. You can see pretty quickly how indexed annuities can offer quite a bit more upside than their fixed counterparts that we talked about earlier. Let's wrap up this example by jumping into year 5. This time, our participation rate drops back down to 60%. In this year, the market is flat at 0%, but we still manage a meager return of 1.5. How did this happen? Well, this will lead us to our next crediting option. But to start the year, we decided to allocate half of our contract to the 60% participation rate, and the other half we allocated to a guaranteed 3% fixed rate. Now, I don't recommend arbitrarily bouncing back and forth between crediting strategies, but most index annuities now offer a fixed rate option that's available to you. In essence, we're taking what the first deferred annuity we talked about, the fixed annuity, we have the option to use this as part or all of our allocation within the indexed annuity. You're probably starting to see why these have become pretty popular contracts, as they have the flexibility to combine benefits and adjust along the way. So we have the participation rate and guaranteed rate option. I will zip through a couple of these last crediting methods as they are not as often used, but some annuities will have what's called a cap in lieu of a participation rate. A cap could be 5%, for example, and you are credited with all of the gains up to 5%, but do not receive anything above 5%. Another crediting method is called a spread or a buffer. With this option, you might have a 4% spread that is subtracted from any gains you would have received. So if the market returns just 4%, you're still breaking even at a return of 0, since the 4% return minus your spread of 4% equals 0. If the market returns 10% after subtracting the 4% spread that we have for this example, your return was 6%. And last, most index annuities have the option to add an income rider for a cost to be paid out of your account value. If you select this option, think of your account value as the money you can spend and use if you need it. This is your true account value. You will also have another value called your income account or your income value, and this is what you can turn on for income, but with very specific rules to follow. The biggest rule is going to dictate how much you can withdraw each month. So just because you might see a really large income account value, that doesn't mean you can spend that however you like. Traditionally, this is where a lot of confusion comes from, because people would often think they are receiving a guaranteed 7% return on their annuity, when in reality, that rate was only growing their income account and not their actual account value. I feel like I've brought up a lot of positive points about index annuities, so let's look at some of the other side of the coin and talk about potential downside. First off, I want to reiterate that they are long-term contracts that have surrender charges if you want to get out of the contract early. With proper planning, this should be a non-issue, but it's worth addressing. Secondly, the insurance company can adjust their rates within each crediting strategy each year for the better or the worse. Don't be surprised if you get a really good participation rate of 80%, that it comes back to something more reasonable the following year. Contractually, they often have the ability to drop rates very low, perhaps even as low as a 10% participation rate or just 1% for the guaranteed rate if you select that option. Obviously, if that happened, that would not be a contract you would be happy with, so it's important to know the insurance company's history with rates before starting a contract. A third potential downside is that many annuities these days operate on a bit of what I would call smoke and mirrors. They have so many bells and whistles that at the end of the day, it sounds great, but it's trying to do too much and it doesn't end up doing anything particularly well. This can often be the case when you are trying to grow your account value, but you're also paying for an income rider and trying to grow that at the same time. And I'm sure there could be a couple more that I'm missing, but another that jumps to the top of mind is similar to that last one. Beware of annuities that combine crediting strategies and has too much going on at once. For example, I've seen index annuities that have a participation rate, a cap, and a separate fee all wrapped in one crediting method. If you looked at each one individually, it looks pretty attractive, but when you see them as a whole, you're not really putting yourself in a position to succeed. I just had one more jump in my head, and this may be the biggest overarching problem with index annuities altogether. So often, index annuities are positioned incorrectly, and they are made out to be the best thing since sliced bread. There's a saying that, unfortunately, I think is often true, and that's that indexed annuities are often sold rather than bought. Essentially, what this is getting at is that people don't wake up one day thinking, I should go buy an annuity today. Instead, they are frequently sold, and often by agents or advisors who are not able to advise on a portfolio as a whole. To repeat a line from my last podcast that I recorded about annuities, of course an annuity is the advice solution when that is all they are licensed to sell. And this can lead to an over-recommended product, often by underqualified advisors. All right, we are off to a pretty good start, and we'd laid the foundation for the last two types of annuities that we will discuss, but I think I'm going to call an audible here and hold the rest of this for our next episode coming in 2 weeks. There's just too much to cover, and I like to keep these episodes right around 20 minutes or less. So with that, we will knock out our last two annuity types along with answers to 3 questions that I often hear when it comes to annuities. Don't hesitate to reach out via the show notes if you have any ideas for the show, or if you would like a complimentary review of your own retirement plan. And speaking of review, since we have quite a few new listeners, I'd be forever grateful if you hop in and give us 5 stars and a quick review for the show. All of this helps reach a wider audience, so a big thank you if that's something you've already done. Check out healthywealthywiseretirement.com for past episodes, and stay tuned for part 2 coming in just 2 weeks.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, we would love if you took a quick moment to leave an honest review. Of course, we're shooting for 5 stars, but if you have suggestions to improve the show, we would love to hear from you too. Just click on the podcast name, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, and scroll down to ratings and review. Thanks again for your support, as this helps us reach a wider audience and help even more retirees just like you. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Lauren Sherman is a certified financial planner and co-owner of Integrity Wealth Management, an investment advisor serving retirees in search of their own healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement lifestyle.